So I want to congratulate you all for embarking on an experiment. So, like I said, I never know how many people are going to be here. The last time that I spoke at Rural Life Conference, there were 2 people in here that weren't related with the aquaculture department, and neither of them had ponds, so I was just kind of practicing my talk. So I thought of a novel approach that I'm sure I'm going to get some kind of reward for, is I'm going to do something called an inverted workshop. I just made it up because I thought it sounded cool. Basically, I have no idea what we're going to talk about for the next hour. I'm going to let you decide. So what I want to do first is go down the list of people that have ponds and what issues are you having what problems are you having with your ponds, and we'll try to focus on what is the most common issue in the room, and then I'll tailor the talk to the folks that are having issues rather than just spending 30-40 minutes on something nobody's here for like I did last time. So who's got a pond problem? Let's just start on this side. Who's got a pond problem?
I don't own one.
Good.
That's my problem.
Good. Well, we can talk about construction if we don't have anything in it. No issues? Okay. What you got going?
Basically, the pond is just real muddy. You know,
Okay.
You never can see through the water. It's always muddy. It dries up a lot. Instead of growing, instead of expanding, it kind of dries. And then you got weeds coming up in the water. So.
Great. So muddy water, potentially leaks, maybe, and aquatic vegetation. Okay.
And sometimes it's kind of like a foam on the top. Sometimes.
Okay.
It's kind of like muddy foam sometimes.
All right. Sure thing. I'll refer to these 2 jars up here, and I want you to kind of keep an eye on these things as we go through and see what happens to this one. This one is fairly stable, but just keep an eye on those as we go through the talk and see what happens. And we'll get to those when we get to the muddy water talk. So any other problems anybody's having? Got algae problems?
I got algae bad in mine.
Okay.
And I put them little fishes in there supposed to eat the algae up and all this stuff like that. About 6 of them in there.
Okay. Do you remember what species the fish was?
I got for every name. I got flathead cat, china cat, bass bream.
Okay. What fish did they suggest to put in there to eat the algae?
Well, they told me this algae, all I know. I don't know what I involve them anyway.
Okay, sure.
We've got the same problem. We put grass carp species. They seem to, once they get 3 foot long or real good size, and they slow down and eat.
They get kind of lazy.
Yeah,
for sure.
And then but ours is next to a farm and fertilized each of them, so it's real clear and got big bloom.
Okay.
So that's kind of hard to control.
So we got algae blooms and lazy grass carp. Okay. What else?
It just needs some maintenance. It's got sedimentation.
Okay.
It really needs monitoring, yes.
Alrighty. So main issues, we've got muddy water to talk about, we've got aquatic vegetation, and we've got sedimentation. Let's see. How old is your pond that's filling in?
Oh, I would say probably 20 years old.
Okay.
We just purchased the property in the last couple of years. When we say Gold Pond, the previous landowner purchased the barn, I think, around 20 years ago.
Okay.
Maybe a little longer, maybe even in the 80s, so maybe close to 30 years later.
Alright. What's the drainage like into it? Is it forested or grassy or livestock?
There's one area, it's strictly grass covered.
Okay.
And then the other is a creek channel.
Okay.
That's grass covered and woodland covered on the edges, but then just the channel itself is fairly.
Okay. What's the water get fairly green in the summer? Is it a productive system, or does it stay relatively clear?
So fairly clear.
Okay.
One may be a little bit green than the other. The pond that has the largest filter with the grass cover, it stays the clearest, of course.
Okay. Alrighty. So we've got muddy water, we've got aquatic vegetation, and some sedimentation issues. So So what now?
Smartweeds come out
Smartweed?
pretty bad. around
Okay.
those.
So this is everything I could have potentially thought that we might cover. So my PowerPoint's got 225 slides in it. And what we're going to do is pick which of these categories will cover our issues and try to finish up with extra stuff at the end that my prepared talks don't cover. So we're going to do aquatic vegetation management, and that's going to take us 20 minutes. We're going to do clearing muddy water, that's going to take us about 25 minutes, so that's going to just about eat us up. And I'll talk specifically about sedimentation stuff. Let me try to tie in aeration as well, because that can play into sedimentation fill-in rates as well. So we're going to do aquatic plants first. Then we're going to do muddy water and then aeration.
Could you kind of conclude with some kind of synopsis on construction?
I can try. You can see up at the top,
Yeah, I see
construction,
45
that eats our lunch for an hour. So yeah,
Not good.
I can get some, we'll talk about some general tips and we can chat afterwards because we're done after this. So you and I can chat afterwards about specifics.
You know, I bought some things that they told me to buy to kill the algae in the pond.
And we'll cover that on aquatic plant management.
And I sprayed in there like they told me to do and everything, yeah. And that following week, a lot of my people did. It was, I said, what the devil did?
I'll explain why in a second. We'll get to that. All right. So this is a general step-by-step instruction workshop on aquatic plant management. So my first question to you is, what is a weed? We talk about aquatic plants and usually refer to them as weed. What is a weed? That's a good definition? Yes. Exactly right. Speak up. What was it? Exactly. There is no species of weed. Weeds are just plants that are growing where they're not wanted. So you can have a plant that would provide great benefit to your pond, your fishery, and even the quality of your water. But if it's growing somewhere you don't want it, it has become a weed. So this talk is about what to do to try to control your weeds. So aquatic vegetation management, it's a year-long process. Right now we don't have a lot of plants growing in the pond, but we will soon. And things that you do right now can help control those weeds in April and May when they start growing really thick. Now the amount of plant growing in your pond matters too. So if you've got a couple of patches of it growing in let's say you've got a 2-acre pond and you maybe have 20 or 30 feet of vegetation growing in one little spot, if you're not just totally upset with that being there, leave it. Because plants provide food for small organisms, places for paraphyton to grow that feeds your minnows and your little baby fish, and they provide shade for your sport fish. So if you've got a little vegetation growing in the pond that's manageable and it's not causing you much trouble or heartache, leave it for the fish. It actually does some benefit. The trouble with most ponds is that we're not really diligent with keeping up with them, especially if it's a farm pond that's away from the house and you just check it every few weeks just to see how it's doing. These plants can get out of control very quickly. So most of the time when you get to an extension talk, when we're talking about ponds, they put the big X on vegetation at all. Just don't put anything in it, period. But there are a great deal of benefits to be had with a moderate level of vegetation, but you have to be diligent about keeping an eye on it. The how, in terms of controlling them, it starts with correct identification. And the Extension Service can help you with that. There are online resources. There are little booklets. I don't have any of these to give out. This is my special one. But you can go to a place online called Texas A&M Aquaplant. It's pretty simple. You can just go into a Google search or any search engine and type Aquaplant. And Texas A&M operates this, and it is a wonderful database for just photographic pictures of plants with descriptions of those plant species and even control methods. And to be perfectly honest, our extension specialists and agents, they go to that website all the time for identification to double check our guesses on what these plants are. And it's something you can look at for free. If you know you've got a plant in the pond and you want to narrow it down and say, well, I think it's either lily pad, or it's a fragrant water lily, or it's an American lotus, one of those three, and then you talk to your extension specialist and they can say, oh, well, it's a hardy water lily, and you can kind of narrow it down for them. All right. Next big thing is selecting the appropriate control method, which is what we'll talk about here, and then actually following the instructions on either the manual for doing it or the label that's on that herbicide, and keep up with the results. See if it works, see what changes, and make adjustments if you need to. So like I said, there are some do-it-yourself plant ID resources. Aquaplant is, in my opinion, the easiest one to navigate and just to see and find what you're looking for. The Florida Center for Aquatic and Invasive Plants also operates a database. They have some different species in Florida than we do, but a lot of them are similar. Their database is very extensive, great information on their site, but I find it a little bit more difficult to navigate than Aquaplant. But if you don't find your plant in Aquaplant, you can probably find it on the Florida's website. And then the county extension agents, depending on which county, some of them deal with a lot of pond issues, and they're very good at diagnosing the plants that they have in their county. They know their counties. A lot of times you can just call the county agent and they can say, oh, well, that's American lotus, or that's alligator weed, and they just know it just like that. If you've got a new agent in the county who's not quite familiar with it yet, they might need some help, and if they can't identify it, then they ship it up to us, and we can identify it. All you have to do is snap a picture of it and text it or email it, and we can get it handled. All right, so selecting the appropriate treatment is necessary for effective control. You use the wrong treatment, you can get poor results. So the main categories are physical, mechanical, biological, and chemical. Physical control methods, basically you're changing the physical properties of the water itself. Either changing the depth of the water by raising or lowering the impoundment, or changing the color of it. Aquatic dyes are actually quite effective at controlling submersed plants if you get the concentration of the dye high enough, and it's a relatively inexpensive product. I think if I recall right, I was dealing with a 15 or so acre impoundment out in the Stuttgart area, and they needed to get dye on it, and I think it was going to cost them like $200 to get the right concentration for a 15-acre pond. That's pretty cheap in terms of vegetation control. What the dyes do, they don't kill anything directly. They just change the color of the water so that light doesn't penetrate as far. And plants need sunlight to do photosynthesis. If they can't get that sunlight, they wither and they eventually die. The trouble with the aquatic dyes is they don't really do anything to shallow plants. Anything shallower than about 3 feet deep, those plants are going to grow just fine because you can't get the dye concentration high enough to shade those shallower ones out. But if you've got a pond that's got weed issues below about 4 feet or more, aquatic dyes are absolutely effective at reducing their growth and maybe even preventing them from growing in the first place. It also helps with filamentous algae. The filamentous algae, those are the stringy, cotton ball, nasty, mossy stuff. They call it moss a lot of times. That floats at the surface of the pond. We typically see the problem when the algae is floating, but it begins on the bottom. It starts growing at the bottom. So if you put a dye in early in the year, you know your pond's going to grow the same weeds it did last year. So if you had a filamentous algae issue last year, it's going to come back again this year. You can put an aquatic dye in right now and keep the concentration of that dye so that the water is colored. It doesn't allow sunlight to reach the bottom, and you can reduce your filamentous algae problems substantially before they'd even start to grow. You can also change the water level. So there are certain plants that don't handle being exposed to open air very well. So if you draw the lake down or draw the pond down in the middle of summer, you can dry out roots and stems and kill some plants right out that way. Check with a specialist first on this, because there are some plants that will just follow the water level down and it'll make your problem 10 times worse. Others can't move quickly enough, they can't spread their roots fast enough to get back down to the water level, and they'll die out. It is an option, but make sure you check with a specialist first to double check that your species you're dealing with will be negatively affected by either raising or lowering the water. Mechanical methods, that basically means using tools or machines to take them out. And I said advantages, cheap, if you're doing it with like hand tools. Machines are outrageously expensive. So there are vegetation harvesters that you can hire to come and scoop up weeds and put them on the bank or haul them off in the truck. That's outrageously expensive. But if you've got a small section that you want to treat, or a very small pond, Or if you have a large pond but you have a fishing pier or a spot on the bank that you'd really like to fish from, you could get some hand rakes, some simple tools to rake out some of those plants and just keep that section clean with just mechanical removal by tools and by hand. I mean, you can go in there and pull them up by the roots if you don't have any other options. And in some cases, this might be the only option. So some municipal ponds or public ponds, community ponds, don't allow any form of herbicide or won't allow you to put any herbivorous fish in there. And you can either use tools or you can pull them up. You have no other options. So sometimes this is the only option. One of the problems with this, it's a lot of labor and it's very short term. A lot of times the plants will regrow fairly quickly because it's just hard to get the whole plant. You try to get the root up and it breaks at the stem and then you can't reach the roots. It's like pulling weeds in the garden. If you don't get the roots all the way out, they're going to come back. So it can be short term, but it's something that you can do at least in a small area and have relatively good control if you keep up with it. Biological controls, basically we're dealing with fish, and there are some fish species that will control certain aquatic plants. Grass carp are the most common and they're widely available. Relatively, for how many you have to put in, relatively a cheap management option. The adult ones can get $6 to $8 a pop, but you may only have to put 3 to 5 of them in an acre to have moderate control. So compared to a gallon jug of certain herbicides that might cost $1,000 for a gallon, a few $100 on grass carp seems like a pretty sweet deal. Stocking grass carp, the stocking rates kind of depends on what plants you're dealing with. They don't eat everything. Contrary to popular opinion, you can't just put grass carp in and expect them to eat all of the plants in your pond. They prefer soft, squishy ones, things like hydrilla. They will do some control on coontail, but they do not like to eat filamentous algae. They don't like to eat any of the emergent plants up at the bank, like the smart weeds, like the alligator weeds. They won't touch them. They might nibble on the leaves if they're starving to death, but they won't control the plants. So check with a specialist to make sure you've got the plant correctly identified and make sure that it matches with the type of food that grass carp like to eat. Another issue is if you look at the shape of a grass carp, they're shaped very much like a hot dog, and they don't have any spines to protect themselves from predation. And they are a tasty little treat for largemouth bass. So if you have a pond that's been well established, it has a fishery in it, it has largemouth bass in it especially, you need to stock grass carp that are 6 to 8 inches or bigger. They're going to be more expensive per fish, but you're not going to lose as many of them to predation. And the bigger fish you stock, the more likely they are to survive in general. So bigger fish if you've already got bass in the pond. And they don't last forever. They get old, they get slow, and they get lazy. After about 5 years, grass carp need to be restocked. The triploid grass carp that are sold in Arkansas and pretty much across the country, they live to be about 10 years old. The diploids that aren't usually sold anymore can live to 15 or 20 or so. But after about 5 years, your grass carp are going to get a little slow. They're going to get a little fat and lazy. So you need to supplement them every 5 to 7 years, so you've got fresh stock in there to control plants. Tilapia are not typically recommended very much because Arkansas Game and Fish hasn't really come out on a solid yes or no if they like tilapia being stocked in ponds. The general rule is they don't want them stocked south of I-40 because most winters the water temperatures are warm enough in the winter that they can survive winter. They are a tropical fish that start to die when the water gets into the low 50s, and they are totally dead by the time the water gets into the upper 40s, which is convenient because they are not a native fish and they could cause some serious damage to natural populations, native species, if they get out of your pond and go into the nearby tributaries and get down into other lakes and other ponds and rivers and such. So I do not recommend them if I survey the pond and see that it has an easy connection to a permanent tributary, or if it's directly connected to a flowing creek, forget it, no tilapia at all. But if you've got a tank out in the middle of a pasture and it's a mile away from any other type of ditch or pond or river or something, go for it. They are very good at controlling filamentous algae, which is a common problem in livestock watering ponds. They are very tasty, despite some popular opinion. And by the time you get through the entire growing season, you'll have a pond full of nice, tasty fish that you can harvest. And when the water gets down into the low 50s, they're going to get real slow and lethargic and up near the surface, and you can just scoop them up with a net and have a hell of a dinner. But just be mindful that you have to restock them every year in most parts of Arkansas, especially northern Arkansas. Goldfish, believe it or not, are pretty good at controlling duckweed and watermeal. So duckweed and watermeal are floating plants. They are the tiny little green things with leaves that float at the surface and have the little roots underneath them. They will control them pretty well. They're a pretty fish. A lot of times they're in color spectrums from just silver to shiny gold, spotted or molted gold and white. They're pretty, but they are, one of the drawbacks is they're pretty and they stick out really well. So if you stock these little goldfish into a pond that already has bass in it, they're dead within an hour. So they're totally impractical for any kind of pond that has big sport fish in it. Hybrid striped bass or black bass or even big catfish will eat them if the opportunity presents itself. So if you've got like a backyard water garden, just a little bitty pond that has a duckweed issue, you can toss some goldfish in there and not have to do any herbicides. Chemical controls, we're talking herbicides at this point. Advantages of herbicides, there are several herbicides that are called contact herbicides that act very quickly on plants. They kill them on contact, that's why they got their name. And you can clear a fairly large area of plants quickly with these contact herbicides. Because they're contact herbicides, you can pick and choose what parts of the pond you want to treat. So if you only want to clear out a section for fishing or a section in front of a boat ramp or something, you can use a contact herbicide, treat that one spot, all those plants will die, and you'll have a nice open spot for a little while. One of the drawbacks of contact herbicides is that they're killing what's there right then. And if they don't get all the way down to the roots, sometimes they just kill the leaf structures, the stem structures. They don't always get down to the root systems. So those plants do often grow back. And a lot of times when we recommend a contact herbicide, we suggest you hit it as soon as the plants start to grow in the spring, late March to April, depending on the climate that year, and expect to have to retreat again in a couple of months when what's left of the stems start to regenerate. It's very low labor. Basically, if you've got plants near the shoreline, you can just walk down the bank with a little spray rig. If you've got a big impoundment and you need to treat large areas, you can build very simple PVC and tank-fed systems that can just hang off the side of the boat. It's fairly simple to accomplish. Main disadvantage to herbicides in general, they're going to be expensive. The herbicides that are rated for aquatic use don't get sold near as much as like Roundup does for terrestrial use. And you have to use an aquatically approved herbicide, one for liability issues, because if somehow your impoundment flooded after you had used a contact herbicide and it went and killed plants and then killed fish in other tributaries that were public water, you would be liable for the damage and you'd get sued for it. Also, the labels for these herbicides are ridiculously expensive. The companies that produce these herbicides, it takes them years to get a label approved for not only terrestrial but especially aquatic use. And they have to demonstrate that it is safe for drinking water, or they have to figure out how long you have to wait between applying it and using it for irrigation. They have to confirm through experimentation that it won't kill fish immediately as soon as it touches water. So there's a lot of stuff that a company has to do that costs a lot of money to get these labels approved. So since there aren't as many aquatic herbicides sold as terrestrial ones, they got to make their money back, and they jack the price up on the aquatics, mainly because the volume of sales is not there. Now it sucks because a lot of the active ingredients in terrestrial herbicides and the active ingredients in aquatic herbicides are exactly the same, but the stuff mixed in with that herbicide, the testing that was done on that aquatic herbicide confirms that it's safe for you to apply it to your pond with your fish. And if you think about, I mean, how many years have you owned your pond? And for the folks that have stocked them, how many hundreds, if not thousands of dollars have you put into stocking those fish, waiting for them to get big enough to catch, and in some cases becoming quite attached to those fish. If you've got some really big prize ones in there, you don't want to put any chemical in there that hasn't been tested to be safe. So it's number one, it's liability, because you can get sued for basically using the product improperly, and it can kill fish that have taken maybe decades to grow. So The label instructions. The instructions on the herbicide that you buy are literally the law, and if you don't follow the instructions that are printed there, you've broken the law. 99 times out of 100, somebody's not going to figure out that you didn't follow the stupid instructions on the label. But if something happened and they figured it out, then you're liable for any of the issues. Now, it's annoying for somebody at the university to stand in front of you, follow the label instructions, it's the law, we'll come and get you. Those instructions aren't just the law, they're also the safe use instructions. So if you use those products like they are described in the label, you're not going to kill your fish. If you apply too much, or if you apply it at the wrong time, you kill too many plants at once, it can result in fish kills. All right, so we kind of talked about the contact herbicides already. There are two main categories of herbicides. They're contact and systemic. Contact herbicides kill on contact, whatever they touch. That's good because they work fast. It's bad because they have to touch it. So it's hard sometimes to get those herbicides down to the roots to get full-blown kill the entire plant. Usually we just burn off the leaves and the stems and they regenerate later in the year. Benefit is they work very quickly and you can control small spots. You don't have to treat the entire impoundment. Systemic herbicides, they are slower to act. So some systemic herbicides, they might take a month or even 3 months to actually fully kill the plant. But in some cases, if you've got a pond that's got 80% coverage of coontail or 80% coverage of a American lotus or something, that's just, the whole pond is completely useless because it's totally covered up in vegetation. A systemic herbicide is a good idea because it will slowly kill those plants and you don't get that rapid die-off, that rapid decomposition that you would with a contact herbicide. So the biggest thing that gets fish kills started in the summer is improper use of herbicides. So we've got algae in the pond, we've got filamentous algae or some kind of weed growing that's covering the whole freaking thing. And I want the whole thing cleaned right now. So I put in the concentration that's necessary to treat the entire pond all at once. Well, when those plants are dying, you've got two whammies going on. You've just killed the thing that produces oxygen in your pond, and all of the biomass of that plant has to decompose. So the bacteria in there are going to start chewing away at those stems and leaves, and that uses up oxygen. So you've got two things that are sucking oxygen out of the system. And if you apply too much contact herbicide, you kill too much plants at once, like what you did, you suck out all of the oxygen out of the pond, and your fish need a minimum level of dissolved oxygen. Most of them can't just come to the surface and take gulps of air like the bowfin can. And you need to have about 3 to 4 milligrams per liter of oxygen in the water for your fish to survive. And even at that level, they're not very comfortable. So with over-application of contact herbicides, you can cause fish kills from not direct toxicity to the fish. You sucked all the oxygen out of the pond by killing the oxygen production and decomposing too much plant at once. It is a really good idea to combine treatments. So this starts to get a little bit more complicated because you're often dealing with the herbicide and all of the variables you have to consider for the herbicide, and then also having a biological control behind it, or a mechanical control or whatever. So in these cases, it's a good idea to speak with a specialist, and we employ we basically call him the herbicide guy out of Jonesboro, that he can sit down and look at your situation and say, this is the herbicide you need to use, this is the treatment, how you need to do it, and you can stock grass carp in there behind it to kind of control what's left. So we often recommend using a herbicide if there's an issue in the middle of the growing season and it's a big nasty problem and they need it cleaned right now. We'll recommend a herbicide to knock back the bulk of the plant problem all at once, and then suggest a low stocking rate of grass carp behind that to kind of keep the plants away. So grass carp are a great cost-effective control method, but by themselves they're a little slow. If you've got a plant that they will eat and you stock the necessary amount of them to control it, it's probably going to take about 2 years for them to get those plants under control, if that's all you do. So, in addition, if you've got a really bad problem, you have to stock 2 or 3 times as many to get the job done than you would if they were stocked at just a maintenance rate. So we'll often suggest putting in a herbicide to knock back the problem, to get it manageable for the grass carp to control later, and then stock just a maintenance level of grass carp. So like I said, the grass carp don't eat everything. Generally our recommendations, and you'll see this in the MP360, is 5 grass carp per acre. And that's a preventative measure, and a lot of times I'll even recommend a lower stocking rate, maybe only 2 or 3 if it's a larger impoundment, because plants are beneficial. If you've got some plants in there, it's good to keep them in. And it's really hard to get grass carp to get the perfect balance of controlling plants without wiping them out. So a lot of times I'll recommend on the low end, just so that they don't moonscape the entire pond, because your fishery benefits from having some plants in there. Now, if you've got really bad issues like the entire impoundment's just covered up with coontail and they can't afford the herbicides to treat the entire impoundment, you can double, triple, quadruple the stocking rate up to 15 or 20 grass carp per acre of vegetated surface area, and they can get the job done, but you're going to need to give them about 2 years to get it under full control, and they need to be restocked every 5 to 7 years to keep young, fresh ones in there. So these are the species that grass carp like to eat. The main ones that we have issues in ponds in Arkansas are the naiads. Southern naiads are the big one, but occasionally there's fanwort. Very rarely have bladderwort, sometimes chara. Hydrilla is a big issue in the southeast and in Florida, but we usually don't see them in small ponds very much. But grass carp do love to eat them. If you get them, the grass carp will take care of it. They will eat coontail and some of the pondweed species, but they don't like it. They'll prefer one of these other species, one of the softer species first, and if none of that is available, they'll start munching on coontail and pondweeds and these natellas, and they will control it, but usually you have to stop more to get that control. Now the other species, like I said, the emergents, the ones that actually have stems strong enough to stick the plant out of the water near the bank, they won't do anything to those. If they're starving to death and there's nothing else in the lower parts of the pond, they'll go up and nibble on the leaves of those. They'll even nibble grass off of your yard if they're starving to death. But they won't control it. They need to have softer stems so that they can chew it all up. Okay. So, what's going on with our jars up here? Have you noticed any changes?
Yes,
Yeah. So this one has stayed pretty much the same. It was already pretty clear. I tried not to disturb that. But this one, it was quite a bit murkier when we started, right? It has started to clear up. The reason is it has a good concentration of this stuff in it. And you can look at it. This isn't anything dirty. It's basically a natural stone called limestone. And it is a product that you can apply to ponds with fish and it won't harm them at all. It's actually it's a cool product for what it does.
Where do you buy it?
You can get it at county co-ops, any ag supplier, because they put that stuff on fields to augment their soil pH, and we do the same thing with the soil pH of water. But it's a relatively cheap product, like $30 to $50 per ton delivered to the site. So you can get a whole lot of it for a relatively low price. The problem is, a lot of times if we need lime, we need a lot of it.
What about chicken fertilizer?
Not good for most things. In most cases, I wouldn't recommend putting fertilizer on any fishing pond. And when we get through this, we'll talk about that more. All right, so let's try to get through clearing water. We've got 20 minutes, I think. Okay, so clearing muddy water. There are handy little tools called Secchi discs that are basically like pie tins that have a black and white alternating colorations on them that scientists use to measure the turbidity of an environment. It's a really quick and fast tool. Most folks aren't going to have that tool, but in general, when we are calling water turbid, it's a measure of clarity. When somebody says that a water is more turbid, it's cloudier. Light can't go through it as much. If it's low turbidity, it's very clear water. Generally, in fishing ponds, the Extension Service in Arkansas recommends a clarity of about 18 to 24 inches. And in general, if you want a quick, fast rule, if you go to the side of the pond or reach over the side of the dock or the boat and you stick your arm up into about your shoulder level, if you can still see your hand, that's about 24 inches for most people. So if your hand disappears before you get all the way to your shoulder, then the water is probably getting up into the turbid ranges. Usually we recommend about 18 inches of visibility as being the lowest visibility before you need to start doing something to try to clear it up. The reason why is that with increasing turbidity, you have decreasing productivity in the system. Part of it is because there's not enough light that can reach the phytoplankton that makes up the base of your pond's fisheries food chain. So if you are trying to grow lots of fish and lots of big fish, you need lots of small fish and lots of minnows and lots of plankton to grow those sport fish. So if the water is muddy, you can't grow as much plankton, so the base of your pyramid is smaller, and you can only stack so much stuff on top of a pyramid. So it's just kind of how the hierarchy of the food chain goes in these ponds. It's also not considered to be very pretty, so if you go by a pond on the side of the road, it's always muddy, not aesthetically pleasing, and not very good at growing fish. So how to fix it first is determining why it's muddy, and we'll reference these jars here in a second. And once you identify why it's muddy, then treat the cause of the problem, not its symptoms. Have you ever heard of the phrase I just said, treating the symptoms and not the source? Basically putting a band-aid on the wrong problem or the wrong issue. That happens a lot in pond management, where they're trying to treat the symptoms of muddy water but not actually solving the problem. So the first step to diagnosing why my pond's water is muddy is to grab a clear jar of water and just sit it somewhere for 24 hours and don't mess with it. If after 24 hours your jar looks like this, water chemistry is not your problem. If after 24 hours your jar looks like this and you haven't messed with it, water chemistry might be your problem. Basically what you are doing is a very poor boy's example of a hardness test. And I'll explain what hardness is in just a minute. Basically, well, I'll explain it right now. Most of the turbidity in ponds or impoundments is caused by clay particles. Clay is a very tiny grain of soil, and it typically has a -1 charge, so it's an ion. It carries a -1 charge, and it is so small, such a low mass, that it can stay suspended in water indefinitely, like this up here. If your jar stays muddy, stays cloudy, basically forever, there's nothing for that little negative charge to stick to, and because it's so light, it just kind of sits there. Now, if you have a sample or a pond that has stuff for it to stick to, then that clay particle will stick to it, sink down to the bottom. In most ponds, those positive charged ions that stick to those clay particles are some form of calcium or magnesium. And if you looked at the chemical formula of that jar we were passing around, limestone is made of calcium carbonate, or some kind of mixture of calcium carbonate and magnesium carbonate. The reason the calcium and magnesium are good at binding up clay is because both of those carry a +2 charge. So they are positively charged ions that will stick to a couple of negatively charged clay particles, and when that clumps together, it gets a mass heavy enough to sink it down to the bottom of the pond. So if you have a good amount of calcium and magnesium in the system, then those clay particles get stuck to it and it sinks it down to the bottom, and your jar ends up looking like this, and you've got nice clear pond water. Rather than this basically doesn't have much hardness in it. There's nothing for the clay particles to stick to, so they just stay in suspension forever. So hardness is basically defined as the positively charged metal ions in water, principally calcium and magnesium. Okay, so we've done our water test. We've got our jar sitting on the table and we've given it 24 hours. If the jar clears, so jar on your right up there, we know that our hardness is good. Something else is screwing up the soil and kicking it up. So it could be either of these things. It could be erosion from waves washing on the bank and kicking dirt off of the bank there. It could be runoff coming from unprotected watersheds, like the creek in your pond. If it doesn't have grass down to the edge there, it could be carrying eroded sediments into the pond and increasing turbidity. Livestock is a big one in Arkansas because we've got lots of livestock production and they need ponds, impoundments for watering and to cool off. Just getting in the pond, the act of getting in the pond for a cow kicks up a lot of mud. And then also there could be bottom feeding fish involved. So things like common carp and bullhead catfish that are common in old fishing ponds, the way they feed is by rooting up the sediment on the bottom looking for worms and invertebrates and stuff. So they kick up a little bit of mud too. If the water does not clear, hardness is one of your issues, but you might also have a hardness issue and one of these. So hopefully your jar clears up and you say, okay, well, we can eliminate the hardness issue. We don't have to worry about that. Then we just have to find what is causing our turbidity. Erosion at the shoreline is a big issue for ponds that are exposed to wind. So think of a pond out in the middle of a pasture, big flat pasture with no trees nearby, and they've just got a little dugout pond out there for watering the cattle or irrigation or whatever, and it just gets blasted by wind all the time. And one of the banks is just eroding away all the time. Well, as long as that bank is being eroded away, turbidity is being added to the system. If you've got a lot of hardness in the system, when the wind stops, that water will clear back up, but every time the wind blows that direction, it starts eating away the bank. So this contributes to shoreline degradation, which takes away habitat, but it also contributes to sedimentation. So all of that sediment that gets chewed off of your bank sinks right down to the bottom of your pond, makes it shallow. Ways to fix it are as variable as ponds are in shape. Riprap is what you typically would see with a big Corps of Engineers reservoir, like the bridges going across big lakes or the dams that impound these big lakes. Big strong rocks to prevent wave erosion. Those dams are still made of dirt and still made of earth that's been compacted, but they put riprap around the edges to protect them from wave action. This is kind of an expensive, most pond owners, because you usually don't have a big nice highway to drive a big truck next to the impoundment and dump those rocks. But if that is an option, it's one of the strongest options. The next option is what's called soft armoring, where you basically introduce some kind of a plant, some kind of hardy species of plant that gets good root integration into the soil and just basically armors it. It gives it something, the roots give the soil something to hold on to. Species that are good at that are like bulrush, has a very high, I forget the rating system, but a very good soil stability rating. It's got a nice network of roots. Cattails are a really common one that you'll see along the side of the road in ditches and along creeks and stuff. I'm trying to think of another one. Water willow does pretty well too, kind of similar looking to smartweed. But bulrush and cattail do a really good job of it. And the benefit that you get from bulrush and cattail is they grow out into the water about 1 foot or 2 deep, and they will essentially build themselves their own little wave dampening system. The waves coming into the stems of those big thick bulrushes and cattails will lose a lot of energy while they're going through those stems, and by the time it reaches the bank, there's not as much energy in that wave to erode away the soil, and then what energy is there, the soil's got lots of roots in it to hold it together. So soft armoring is actually a very effective tool for smaller ponds, ponds that are far away from a route of hauling in big heavy stuff on a truck. And it gives you the added benefit of looking natural. So you can select species that look pretty. Bulrush looks pretty nice. The smartweed and the water willow are controllable and they look fairly nice along the bank. Runoff from the tributary can bring a lot of sediment, and this can be a big issue for small pond owners because you don't always own the tributaries that feed your impoundment. So if you've got a large property and you own all of the drainages that come into the pond, then you have power to change the coverage on that tributary. So anything that has a bare soil ditch or a drain, you almost always see some kind of an erosion cut in it. And that's because soil is easily eroded by water. Water is very powerful when it moves. Everybody has seen the Weather Channel when it floods in a city. You've got cars washing off the road and it's only like 1 foot deep. Water is incredibly powerful, and soil is easily cut away. So any kind of bare soil just gets washed away with rain events, and especially if you've got a ditch or a gully that funnels that water into a small area, it cuts into soil really bad. So if you've got any of these near a pond, the first thing you can try to do is just get it seeded with something. Talk with the county extension agents and see what grasses grow well in your area and try to seed that thing. If fertility is an issue, fertilize it. If chemistry is an issue, put some lime on it. Get something growing on that bare soil, and that will reduce the turbidity in your pond. If that is not an option, you could also create diversions where that water has to zigzag through some kind of a man-made structure. Anything that you can slow down the speed, the velocity of the water, or put stuff in its way. I've visited, I forget what town it was, but they were having a sedimentation issue. And they had a nice little ditch that was feeding it. And there was kind of a shallow spot that was, kind of looked like a little swamp. It was just shallow, muddy, didn't look very good. And they were looking for solutions to try to clear up the turbidity in the system. And a lot of their runoff came through this one little stretch. And I suggested to them, well, you've got a shallow, swampy spot that you can't walk on anyway. You can't get mowers to keep it clean anyway. Make yourself a little artificial water, help me out here, a little marsh, a little swamp there with various species of bulrush, cattail, some shoreline emergence, and create yourself a little filter. So when you look at swamps, all the plants and all the grasses and stuff, it looks all gnarly and nasty and hard to get around. Swamps and marshes are wonderful filtration systems, and they clean up a lot of sediment and a lot of pollution out of stuff that comes out of rivers and cities. So if you've got a tributary, a ditch or a ravine or whatever, that's dumping a lot of sediment into your pond, especially if you don't own the whole tributary, the whole ditch, you could just create a little marsh with bulrush, cattails, something to capture that sediment, to slow that water down before it comes into your pond. Or you could just use erosion barriers, the stuff that they put around construction sites, the mesh fence with the iron posts in there to keep them straight and the little plastic lining. You could create a little baffle system that makes the water have to go back and forth through that network of baffles. Anytime you can slow water down, that reduces how much crap it can hold. So it sinks down at the bottom, and when those baffles fill up, you can just take a shovel and clean them out, and you're ready to load back up. Anything you can slow that water down and cover up sediment, you're in good shape. All right, so livestock are a big issue because a lot of ponds in Arkansas are built for livestock watering. When ponds are being built from scratch, if they contact a livestock specialist or a pond specialist and they know that they're going to be using the pond for livestock watering, a lot of times they will suggest installing some kind of an external watering system. There are great benefits to this. Number one, you maintain the integrity of the pond, the slopes of the shoreline, and you can also have good fishing in a pond that's watering cattle if you've got an external system. The ponds that you normally see on the side of the road that have got cows loafing in them, you've got lots of things that are going on that are influenced by the livestock getting in there. Number one, turbidity and shoreline damage. So the cows are very heavy and they sink into the mud. So first they kick mud up into suspension. They reduce the stability of the shoreline, so wave action is going to make that shoreline erode even faster. Things that people don't think about with livestock getting in there, one's pretty easy. When cows go into ponds, they poo a lot. So basically the nutrients that are not digested by the cows goes into water and creates a more fertile environment. It's basically fertilizing it. And those excess nutrients can lead to excessive planktonic algae blooms. We want some algae in our pond because that feeds our minnows and it feeds our small fish. But when they get really thick, they can actually create oxygen swings so dramatic that a pond growing a lot of plants might actually kill your fish, because those plants at night go to respiration just like your fish and your animals do. So you can get wildly swinging levels of dissolved oxygen in ponds that have really thick algae blooms. Another thing that folks don't think about with ponds that are shallow and have cows in them, muddy water gets hotter than clear water. The mud particles, the sediment that's up in suspension, it absorbs more heat energy from the sun than just water. So these muddy ponds will get warmer faster than clearer ponds around them. A livestock specialist would tell you that hot water is not as good for cows as cold water. So in the big part in August, July, August, and parts of September, it's freaking hot in Arkansas, and livestock needs some kind of refuge. They need to cool off. They benefit better from having a cool water source. Number one, the water is cooler, so it's healthier for them. Number two, the hotter the water is, the more likely it is to grow cyanobacteria. And cyanobacteria can produce toxins that can make animals and people sick, and in some cases it can kill animals. There have been reported cases, confirmed cases of cyanobacteria blooms in hot, muddy, nutrient-rich impoundments, killing like dogs and pigs and stuff. So it's not healthy for the animals, and it basically destroys any kind of fishery that's in the pond. If these external systems are not an option, so somebody's already built the pond and they're not going to rebuild it, re-engineer it to make this, they can fence off the entire perimeter of the pond select a small section that they're going to reinforce with gravel or riprap, some kind of rock, sand on the bottom, and fence that section off so that the cows can still get into the pond. They can still get some water and cool off a little bit, but they can't just tromp around in the mud and kick up a bunch of mud and put a bunch of nutrients in there. This is the next best option, and this is a good option. This allows you to have the livestock get some fresh water. It doesn't destroy the chemistry and the cleanliness of the water, and everybody is healthy for it. So zooming through fish, common carp and bullhead catfish are very common in small ponds, especially ponds that have permanent creeks that feed into them. They're real difficult to get out. Unfortunately, about all I can tell you is if you have a pond that's infested with common carp or bullhead catfish, the only way you're going to effectively get them out is to drain the entire pond and kill every fish in it. Sorry, that's all there is to it. You can't fish them out fast enough. There are no methods that you can effectively remove them without removing everything else. Sorry. Okay, so if chemistry is the problem, so we don't have enough hardness, we don't have enough calcium or magnesium in the system, there are products that you can apply to fix that. We've already talked about agricultural limestone. It is moderately effective at clearing turbidity, but it takes a whole lot of it. Usually we're talking 4,000 pounds per acre of ag lime to clear a turbid pond. So when that lime contacts water, it dissolves into bicarbonate, carbonate, and calcium. And that calcium, it can either convert into other materials or it can stick to clay particles that are in the water. And the more of that calcium that's in there, the more clay gets bound up and the more it clears it out. So ag lime is okay at it, but it's not the best. Other products you can use, calcium sulfate, also known as gypsum, is a good option. It only takes about 1,000 to 2,000 pounds per acre, so not near as much as ag lime. It does not affect water chemistry, so it is safe to apply. The best option, if your chemistry allows it, is aluminum sulfate, also known as alum. It only takes about 150 to 250 pounds of aluminum sulfate per acre to clear what would have taken 4,000 pounds of ag lime. So it's way more effective at clearing up water than ag lime is. The drawback to aluminum sulfate is one of the potential species that aluminum might create, chemical species, is hydrogen sulfide. So a powerful acid. So if your system does not have a high enough alkalinity, and we haven't talked about alkalinity yet, and we don't have the time to, if the pond does not have enough alkalinity in it, the aluminum sulfate will cause a pH drop so rapidly that it will basically burn the gills out of your fish and kill it. So this is a product that is extremely effective, but you have to have a water test done to check your alkalinity first, and the Extension Service can do that. You just have to do it. Okay? So I wanted to cover aeration real quick, and this won't take too long. Basically, it's an overview of the different types of aerators and what they're good for. But what I wanted to start with was talk about daily cycles of oxygen and carbon dioxide. So in productive ponds, and even in unproductive ones, but especially in productive ones, during the day, planktonic algae, the little microscopic plants that make the water look green, and the rooted vascular plants that grow from the bottom, they produce oxygen. We know about photosynthesis. They produce oxygen that dissolves into the water and contributes to the water's dissolved oxygen concentration. So in a productive system that's got lots of algae and plants, by the middle of the day, early afternoon, we reach the maximum amount of oxygen that's going to be in that system. And in some cases, it might reach 12, 13, 14 milligrams per liter. Fish need about 4 milligrams per liter or more to be happy. They start to get real sick and start to die below that. But if you've got about 4 to 5 milligrams per liter, your fish will be happy. And in the middle of the day, we've got gobs of it. We've got all we'll ever need. The trouble is with these productive systems, at night, those plants are going to go into respiration, just like the animals and the fish do. So instead of putting oxygen into the system, they're taking the oxygen out. So they had a huge capacity to build all this oxygen during the day. They're going to take the same amount back out at night, especially during the hot parts of the year. So the dissolved oxygen concentration will go back down during night, and it will be at its lowest first thing in the morning. Right when the sun comes up, that's the point where oxygen is going to be at the lowest concentration. Inversely of what goes on with oxygen is carbon dioxide. So carbon dioxide, that is a byproduct of respiration. When we breathe out, we're putting out carbon dioxide. When fish breathe out, they're putting out carbon dioxide. When plants are respiring at night, they're putting out carbon dioxide. So during the day, carbon dioxide is used for photosynthesis, so it goes down during the daytime and goes back up during the night. Well, this fluctuation causes pH changes. And carbon dioxide is a weak acid, so the more carbon dioxide that is in the system, the lower the pH is going to be. It's inverse, so it's confusing. But because it's a weak acid, that's going to drop the pH. And this pH swing is dictated by the level of alkalinity in the system. So the higher your alkalinity, the more stable your pH is. And that's why I wanted to cover this slide, because it kind of talks about alkalinity. So have your water tested if you've never had it tested. Check it for alkalinity and hardness, because it can tell you a great deal about how stable the chemistry of the water is, how healthy the fish can be, and it can also indicate issues you might run into, like muddy water if the hardness is too low. So if we've got a really productive system, or if we're trying to grow more or bigger fish, we can supplement what is naturally produced with aeration. And what I'm going to do is blow through these and talk about the pros and cons of each type, because it's something that doesn't typically get covered, and there are lots of options out there and very little analysis between the options. So paddle wheel aerators are very expensive, but they are also the most effective at putting dissolved oxygen into the water per dollar of electricity. You don't normally see these on fish ponds because they're often big, they're ugly, and they're expensive. And they're expensive to operate. They provide primarily oxygen, but they also circulate the water a little bit on the surface. So if you go to a fish farm and you drive by and look at the ponds right in front of the aerators, you'll see water bubbles getting pushed all the way across the pond, because they create a great deal of current, but it's fairly close to the surface. So if you've got a 5 to 6 foot deep pond, these aerators will keep the whole thing aerated and circulated quite well. Propeller aspirators are surface mounted aerators that basically act kind of like a boat motor, but they're pointed down into the water and they're stationary. And the aspirated ones, basically that means it's got a hose that goes up to open air and shoots a string of bubbles into this propeller. So basically the propeller is cavitating the whole time and creating lots of bubbles. For aeration, what you're looking for is lots of bubbles. These are really effective at aeration and also circulation. So if you've got a deep pond and you want to try to unlock that whole pond and get whole use of that volume, a circulating aspirator pump is quite effective at that. Vertical pumps that float right at the surface, you'll see these in several ponds. These are pretty common and pretty widely available. They're simple. It's basically just a little propeller with a cage around it, and it sits underneath this big plastic float, and it creates this little bubble of white water. And that white water is water being oxygenated. And it's a good oxygenator, not a great circulator, so it's only effective at circulating up a foot or so. But it's also good at preventing ice cover, and it can even help kind of keep duckweed under control. Now, diffuser systems, these are handy in water that's deeper than about 8 to 10 feet. All of our other circulators and aerators, they're good maybe down to 8 feet, but below that they don't really do any good because it's hard to get a propeller to push that amount of water down deep. Diffusers are operated by a compressor pump that's up on the bank. It could be by the house and you just run a big long hose down to the pond. And you've got a network or a single little diffuser that sits on the bottom of the pond, and it releases streams of bubbles. And in each of those bubbles contains oxygen, so the oxygen dissolves out of those bubbles into the water, and they also create circulation. So the movement of those bubbles going from the bottom to the top creates little vortices throughout the pond, and you can get the entire pond mixed. Now the reason I wanted to get to this is because ponds that are experiencing lots of sedimentation, a lot of times it's not just mud and dirt that's getting accumulated at the bottom. A lot of times it's also organic material that's accumulated. And the reason that organic material accumulates more thickly at the bottom, number one, it's just that's where stuff naturally sinks to. But also, most pond bottoms are anoxic during the summer, and in some cases throughout most of the year. And the stuff, the bacteria that break down the organic material at the bottom of ponds are aerobic. So if there's no oxygen for those aerobic bacteria to gobble up that organic material, it'll just keep stacking up until the pond becomes a grassland. So one solution to sedimentation is to see how deep the system is, see how much of that sediment is actually organic. And if it is primarily organic, sometimes all you got to do is stick a diffuser down there and get that lower level oxygenated so those bacteria can do their job. And there are products online, this is kind of a cautionary tale, there are products online for like beneficial bacteria or organic eating bacteria. The aerobic bacteria that are in your pond, that naturally exist in your pond, will do just as good as that packet of expensive live bacteria that you buy from those pond management companies. Get it aerated, you'll get the benefit of breaking down the organics, you'll get circulating water, you can grow more fish, and the naturally occurring bacteria will do the job. Okay? Any follow-up questions, because it's almost time for lunch.
When your pond turn over and you kill most your big fish, is it overstocked? Your pond overstocked, just ain't enough oxygen getting to it?
It's mainly oxygen. It's not necessarily a variable of how many fish are in there. It's just how much oxygen is available.
So something like that would take care of that?
Yeah, now we have to look at your pond characteristics. If it's shallow, then a diffuser won't do any good. These are usually only going to help you if the water's 8 to 10 feet.
20 foot deep?
Absolutely will help. And
Well, you need a scuba dive to take that down.
just about. Now most of the time those models are weighted. So if you could take a little John boat out there and say, I'm in the deepest spot, and bloop, let it go, and it'll just sink themselves down to the bottom. But yeah, if you've got a 20-foot deep pond, a diffuser system is what you need to prevent turnovers. And what's cool about these systems is if they are run continuously during the summer, and there are enough of them for the area of volume that needs to be mixed, they can prevent thermal stratification completely. And if you don't have a thermally stratified pond, you will never have a turnover. So you could basically have healthy water from the top to the bottom all year long with the diffuser system. Okay. So we're very much out of time, and I think lunch is going to start in the next 5 minutes. So.